Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy, a pay and reward consultancy where our vision is to create a future in which organizations take a fair and equitable approach to pay and communicate this clearly and honestly to their employees. My name is Rameez Kaleem, your podcast host, and today we're discussing the complex issue of pay gaps and how the rise of remote work and now the drive for many organizations to bring people back into the office is going to impact positively or negatively the careers and earnings potential of women and people of color. Our guest today is Michelle Gyimah. Michelle is a pay gaps expert that works with organizations to understand their pay gaps and focus on the right metrics and actions. Welcome to the podcast, Michelle.
Hi, Rameez. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast today.
And we spoke last year on the pay scale webinar where we were both talking about different aspects of pay, but we didn't really get a chance to discuss the topic of pay gaps in any detail. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about your background, your experience, and what made you get into this area of looking at pay gaps and working with organizations on this?
Yeah. So to be honest with you, I fell into it accidentally. It wasn't like on my career plan. You know, when I grow up, I want to be a pay gaps strategist. I worked at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is a UK body which advises employers and service providers and educational establishments on all things to do with the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act. And so I found myself in a position where I was working on issues around equal pay, the gender pay gap, and pregnancy and maternity discrimination. And to be honest with you, when I first started, I didn't know anything about any of those subjects. And so I was kind of like learning on the job, as it were, advising employers on how to navigate those issues in real terms within their businesses. And after a while, I really enjoyed it because I recognized that, you know, these were like fundamental issues within the workplace and within society. So then I decided to set up my own business, which is Equality Pays. And I essentially work with organizations to help them understand what their pay gap data is telling them and to help them make sense of it so that they can focus on the right metrics and the right things to do in their organizations to address not only reducing the pay gap figure, but also to address what the root causes of the pay gap is within their organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a common trend that you hear in HR with a lot of us falling into this area because you don't really realize how big or how vast the different options are within pay and HR. And I think for me it was a little similar. I fell into sort of consultancy and pay, but one of the things that I find quite frustrating sometimes when it comes to things like equal pay and pay gaps is the confusion, which I blame the media for a lot of this with their headlines, and the confusion around gender pay gap and equal pay, and recognizing that, you know, gender pay gap is an average measure of male and female workers or white and non-white workers for ethnicity pay gap, whereas equal pay is looking at equal pay for equal work. And actually, I look at a lot of the guidance from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, so it's really interesting that I used to work there. But what are some of your biggest frustrations when you are working with organizations around pay gaps? Is it the same issue, or do you come across other things that really frustrate you at times?
Yeah, so I think in the early days, it was the conflation of the two. particularly for organisations. The media still get it wrong today. I still see that quite a lot. But I'm at the stage now where we've had pay gap reporting for 7 years here in the UK. So most organisations now actually do understand the difference between the two. But what I would say in terms of the frustration that I feel for on behalf of employers is the way in which pay gap reporting has become this tool to be able to judge organizations with, that this one figure can be such a defining figure whereby people will make assumptions or make decisions about an organization based on the size of their pay gap. And so, and a lot of that is because of the public nature of this, because the idea behind it was if organizations had to report on this every year in the public eye, then it would galvanize action. And I think to a certain extent, if we were to think about the purpose of pay gap reporting and that being the purpose, then that has been successful because it has really focused people's attention. But the flip side of that comes with it is the judgment piece, so the way in which you can create league tables and decide who's the 10 worst organizations within a specific sector, etc. And that causes a lot of problems for organizations in the sense that a lot of organizations want to avoid being in that league table, as it were. So then the focus becomes, well, how do we just get this figure down as fast as we can or as low as we can, as opposed to, well, let's take a step back and look at why we have this figure. So what are the things that we can influence and what are the things that are beyond our control? And how do we focus on the things that we can influence? And so I do see a lot of organizations having this very kind of tunnel vision approach to it of what can we do to reduce this pay gap as fast as possible, as opposed to what are the reasons for it? And, what can we look at systemically within the way in which we operate as an organization to address the root causes? And I sense that organizations are coming to that realization themselves now, that actually it's not just about chasing the number down, but about looking at, well, what makes sense for us as an organization for us to focus on to show that we are progressive and that we are inclusive and that we do focus on equitable career progression.
I I think that's interesting about the league tables, because when it comes to a lot of these things, I guess organizations are thinking about PR and what looks good for us and what doesn't. And I can see that influencing their thinking, and I've seen where organizations are, you can end up with bias in the other direction as well, can't you? To try and eliminate those gaps where, and I think what doesn't help is, did you hear about the bot on that was automatically publishing the pay gaps of organizations on Twitter every time they posted something about International Women's Day or something like this, which again, I think, while it's funny, I think doesn't help, because you can have a gender pay gap of 15% but have pay equity, and you can have a zero gender pay gap and have a lot of pay inequity. So how do you help with that perception of, oh, 15%, this is a bad number, and creating that understanding and education around that gap, where for a lot of people, they just, they don't really go into in depth with these topics. They're just looking at an overall number and thinking, well, my organization is terrible.
Yeah, the gender pay gap bot. so much to say about that. So much so, actually, I did record an episode on my own podcast talking about how to handle the gender pay gap bot, because it seemed to come out of nowhere and caused such a furore. Like, I had so many messages the first year it came out saying, "Have you seen this on Twitter?" But yeah, you're right. Jokes aside, I can understand the purpose of it, and I actually went to an event where the creator talked about why they created it. And they created it from a sense of a place of frustration that they felt progress wasn't being made fast enough. And in their defense, what they said was, is that, look, we are just putting out information that's already out there, but just focusing attention on a very specific day to galvanize more conversation in the hope that it will galvanize more actions. But I can see the downside of that in terms of organizations being very resistant to talking about their achievements and the things that they've done if their pay gap figure doesn't look great. I mean, in fact, I was talking to a client in the tech space who has told everybody not to tweet anything about International Women's Day. That's just the blanket advice. Don't say anything, which I think is a shame because it's stifling that conversation. It's stifling the celebration, and all of the kind of things that you put out about your organization, all the PR. It's to tell people what's happening inside in the hope that they would see you as an employer of choice. So I do think it's a shame that some organizations feel like that. But the thing is that is part of our landscape now. The bot is not going to go away. And they have said if we have ethnicity pay gap reporting and we have access to data, they'll be doing the same thing. So organizations need to be in a space of understanding that there is always going to be somebody that has an opinion about your pay gap. And you also need to be in a place where you have to understand your pay gap because everybody's pay gap is different for different reasons. Excuse me. And so you have to get comfortable and confident that you understand the nuances of your own pay gap. And you have to think about, well, what is your comms plan going to be around holding these conversations? So that if you do get pushed back in a really public way, you're not finding yourself on the back foot. You're not finding yourself just being very defensive or not saying anything at all out of fear. And so this is what I, help organizations kind of understand that the pay gap is very, very nuanced. And even though you are asked to produce, a single figure or several figures, it's your data and you get to set the narrative around it and you should know what makes it up, why you have it. And so you have to get comfortable and confident in being able to hold that conversation, both internally for your employees who may not understand the nuances, as well as for those external audiences as well.
So when it comes to hybrid working, remote working, this process has really been accelerated, hasn't it, over the last few years with the pandemic. Have you seen much change over those few years with initially a massive rise in remote working to now probably more hybrid working, but there are organizations that are calling people back into the office. So what sort of changes have you seen over the last few years in terms of the pay gaps of organizations? Is it moving in one direction or is it fluctuating?
I think it's fair to say that there's fluctuation, and quite a number of organizations that I'm talking to are kind of in this place of despairing because they're doing so much good work behind the scenes and they're finding that their pay gaps are either stagnating or they're getting steadily worse. And it's interesting, looking at this from the point of view around hybrid working and remote working, because obviously, as you know, with the global pandemic, so many organizations were forced to change the way in which they operate practically overnight. And for the longest time, we have been told this story that if we could implement flexible working, at a much higher rate in more organizations, this is going to be one of the things that will really drive the gender pay gap down. But that's not what we're seeing at the moment. I mean, there is drops in the ONS data, but not at the rate at which people would expect it, considering that I think it's something like 3/4 of organisations in the UK adopt some kind of hybrid working. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that, in principle, many organisations that are able to have adopted hybrid working in some way, shape, or form. So there's less stigma to attach to it. It's much more normal. People go to interviews. It's very common for them to have that conversation openly, whereas before that wasn't the case. It was much more of a rarity. But I'm not convinced that organisations have kind of looked at the systemic changes that need to be made within the organisation for people that are working in a hybrid way to ensure that pay gaps are not exacerbated. Because one of the key issues around why, in particular, women and people of color are not able to progress in the workplace was around presenteeism, and that's really difficult if you've got caring responsibilities or if you have a disability, or for whatever reason you're not going to be in the workplace every single day. And so now that we have hybrid working where people are working in all sorts of different working patterns and working in different places, we need to address that issue around, bias and the habits and the beliefs that we have around, what constitutes good work, who is a good worker, who is management material. And if we still have the issue of presenteeism, because that's not been addressed in terms of how managers lead and make decisions, then we could be in danger of exacerbating the pay gap further, even though we have much more flexible working.
Do you think that, when we're talking about remote working, it's does it apply to everyone in the organization? Because we know that one of the biggest, the biggest factor in pay gaps is lack of representation at senior levels. And if your CEO is male and 80% of the leadership team is male and they get paid, significantly more than everyone else, that's going to push up our average. And do you think that the concept of remote working and flexible working is less acceptable as you progress to more senior levels and you are required to come into the office a lot more and be present and be available all the time? And is that the reason that maybe the impact has been less? Because yes, flexible working is there for the vast majority, but is not necessarily available to people at the top.
I think that could be a key concern. And for me, that really comes down to, the ethos of senior leadership and how they see flexible working. I mean, this was an issue pre-pandemic, and it was also an issue for part-time workers, in the sense that if you worked part-time, there was only so far that you could go within an organization. And, we've not had hybrid working as, as something that most organizations do for very long. And so, it could be that, we need to do some more research to see, well, what does flexible working actually look like, and hybrid working? Like, if you were to break it down in terms of positions within organizations, what do we see? And it might well be that we still see the higher up the organization you go, the less flexibility there is for you. And if that's the case, again, that requires a mindset shift, doesn't it, in terms of what is acceptable for people at different levels within the workplace. And is it that the higher up you go, those people need to be seen around the office or within that workplace? So I think this is going to be one of those things where we'll have to see how things go, over the next couple of years to get some real concrete answers as to what the impact is.
Have you ever worked with an organization that said, "Oh, our gender pay gap is 10%. Can you work with us and help us to make sure that we can get to zero?" And what's your view around people thinking, "Oh, anything positive is means there's a problem, and we should work towards getting a number that is zero"?
I have to say, gladly, that I've never had a client that's
Okay.
looking for a 0% gender pay gap, and I think partly because the pay gaps that a lot of the clients I work with have are quite high. So to then, have that ambition to get down to zero, I think is probably beyond a lot of people's kind of imagination capabilities. So thankfully I haven't had that. But what I have had is people asking, how can we get this down as fast as possible? Like, what's the quickest thing that we can do? And I still get organizations saying, what's the one thing, wanting to hop on for like a quick chat and hoping that within 30 minutes I can tell them that this is the thing that's going to make the key difference. But I would say that I don't think many organizations are in that space of thinking 0% is the number that we have to aim for, but it's more of a case of, if it's very high, how can we get it down as quick as possible? Because of that idea of it makes us look bad. And they haven't. And I have to then do some work around educating them to explain, the nuances of the pay gap and the fact that they might always have a pay gap, and that you have to be okay with that, providing that you're doing the right things within your organization to make, career progression as equitable as possible for everybody. And that, sometimes some people need some time for that to sink in, because that's a completely different message to what we've been given ever since, pay gap reporting was first launched.
Yeah, maybe this is another thing that we can blame the media for, because you often see stories in that way around, oh, it's going to take X number of years for us to get to a 0%, or and like you said, you may always have that gap, and it's understanding that why it exists, because to me a big factor here is that balance between choice and looking for that equal outcome. Because if you have a pay gap that is down to people making a conscious choice that we don't want to do these particular types of roles, or I want a better work-life balance, I don't want to go into that senior position and work 80 hours a week, then we should be respecting that choice and not thinking about an equal outcome that we think is the right thing. So do you ever have that conversation with organizations or HR professionals around, yes, we need to bring this number down, but we need to be careful that we don't end up creating biases and trying to force people to do things just because we think they should be doing it, not even though they want to make a different choice?
Yes, and this is why when I talk to organizations, I always talk about the fact that career progression will look different to different people. That doesn't necessarily mean always just onwards and upwards, because that doesn't suit everybody. And, employees are in all sorts of different stages of their lives. We have multi generational workforces. And, what suits somebody now won't suit them in 10 years' time. And what they wanted 5 years ago is not going to be the same as what they want today. And so it's not for HR teams to decide what progression looks like. And that always progression means just moving up the ladder. But it's about creating workspaces that allow people to progress in the way that they genuinely want to. And so that word of choice that you mentioned is the thing that comes up for me. And again, that's something that some organizations find difficult to wrap their heads around, but mainly because, again, they're so fixated on, well, what does that mean for our gender pay gap? If we have a whole cohort of people who say, actually, I don't want to go into senior management. And it's not because there's a bad work culture or anything. It's just that that's not right for them. And you can see the kind of like panic in, HR teams' eyes. But ultimately, it's about providing that space where people can make real choices as opposed to having choices forced upon them.
Yeah.
That is super important.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that's that there aren't too many organizations thinking that way. As you know, our focus is all around pay transparency and getting organizations to be more transparent, communicate clearly to their employees. And there's, I guess, discussions around transparency and whether pay transparency could help narrow some of the pay gaps. So, what is your perspective on this, and what sort of changes that you think around pay transparency, particularly, for example, the EU Pay Transparency Directive that's coming in the next couple of years? How do you think these changes could impact pay gaps?
I think it could have a really positive impact. And I know that for some organizations, the concept of pay transparency is terrifying because they think it means that everybody knows everybody's business and we'll be talking about it, over coffee, etc. And, you and I both know that that's not the case. So there's a spectrum and you get to decide, what is right for your organization. But I do think it does have the power to make a real difference in terms of communication and helping employees to understand how pay decisions are made. I mean, one of the biggest kind of stumbling blocks that I see when I go into organizations and I'll be talking to employees, one of the things that comes up time and time again is this lack of understanding around how promotions happen. You know, what you can get if you want to be promoted, what it is that you need to do, when are promotion decisions made, all of these types of things. And sometimes organizations are really resistant to holding those conversations. And when employees try to raise it, they get really bad pushback. But when these conversations are not being had, it creates kind of distrust between the employees and employers. And what will happen is if employees are not feeling valued because there isn't open conversation around this and they don't know what to do or they're being told not to talk about this in the workplace, they will seek that elsewhere. Because one of the key employee values today is around, pay transparency and being able to hold a conversation around pay and around career progression and to know where you can go within the organization. And if organizations are not proactive in providing that, employees will go elsewhere. They will go to an organization that is being very open about what they offer, what career progression looks like, what pay transparency looks like for them, and they will leave. And so for me, even though the UK, for me, sadly, is not in the EU, it's an opportunity to see what is possible if you were to adopt some form of pay transparency and to do it proactively rather than kind of waiting to be forced to do it because your people are leaving or because there might be legislation change or whatever's happening. So even though it seems daunting, I do think it's a great opportunity for organisations to embrace at their own pace and to see the benefits of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also think, it's that wider context that we provide with that pay transparency piece, because when you publish just that number of, let's say, 15%, it can create that perception amongst a lot of people or employees that, oh, maybe we're not being treated fairly. Why is there such a big gap? But if you can, at the same time say to them, oh, but this is due to these reasons, and I'm sure those are the reasons that you go into with your clients, but here's the wider context, and we are treating everyone fairly. Or, for example, we've done an equal pay audit and there are no equal pay risks, but this is why the gap exists. So it's really just that wider piece. And I think it's, one of the things that I'm sure you probably say this is to your clients is, don't just publish the number, but have some commentary and some context around it.
Yeah. Just yesterday, I was talking to a housing association and they had exactly this issue. Their pay gap is actually getting worse, but they've been doing loads of great work behind the scenes. They'd done an equal pay audit and there were no issues. But they were so focused, so focused on the pay gap figure. And I was like, yeah, but you've done loads of other great stuff. You've done an equal pay audit for for years. You were saying we pay people fairly, but you didn't know if that was true or not, and now you know that's true. So that is something that you can really shout about and talk about, because A, it's true, and B, that's of interest and of value to your current employees and your future employees. And you can build on that conversation to then say, well, the reason why we have a pay gap is because of these three key things. And here are the things that we can do to try and mitigate it. But don't forget, we've done an equal pay audit. So we know that everybody's paid fairly, and we've done this and we've done that. And so that, so that is a real situation where people have pay gap figures that don't look great, but they have other metrics that do look great. And that is the key thing that I talk to organizations about all the time. You get to define what success looks like for you. You get to define what metrics make sense to talk about and share in your organization. You get to decide where your focus is going to be, because your pay gap figure is unique to you. And you might be in a position where your pay gap figure looks terrible because of your business model or because of your sector. But that doesn't mean that you have to kind of have your head in your hands thinking everyone thinks we're a terrible organization. It means you need to get going with the education and with the comms so that people understand the nuances behind why you have the figure that you do.
Do you work with a lot of organized? Well, I guess when you are working with a lot of organizations and you dig deeper into their pay gaps, in some cases there might be clear reasons and justification. In other places, there might be a lot of things to address and what changes that they need to make. But do you see any common trends around cultural practices and what sort of workplace culture there is in organizations where you think, oh, this organization needs to do a lot of work, and maybe it's down to their cultural practices, or are those two things completely different and independent?
I would say the workplace culture is a really big factor as to why organizations have the pay gaps that they have, and whether they're really big or not. And for me, it's really important that organizations understand that this is going to be the root cause, because often it will be around policies or habits or behaviors that have been done for such a long time and nobody knows why. So we need so things like looking at recruitment policies, and they'll say, oh, well, we've always done it this way. And then I'll ask questions like, oh, well, when was that decided? And has the landscape changed since then? And what has been the impact? And what have been the results? Are you happy with the results that you're getting? And the answers will be like, no. And it's like, okay, well, then here is, evidence that you need to be looking at this aspect, and you need to be changing some of the things that you do in order to make that difference. And it's interesting when we talk about workplace culture, we're talking about the things that are permitted within an organization and nobody asks questions about. And so sometimes it really is about unpicking why organizations function in the way that they do, and getting them to understand that if they want something different, then there has to be some behavior changes. And so that might require, training or reviewing policies and doing things differently. But ultimately, your pay gap and workplace culture, there's always going to be a link, because the pay gap figure is a result of whatever is happening within your organization. So that's what needs to be examined within the employee life cycle within an organization.
And is there a cultural practice that you would recommend to organizations? For example, transparency or anything else that you think, this is a common thing that I see in organizations. When they have this culture, they have less of an issue with their pay gaps.
That's a very good question. I like to challenge organizations to look at their retention and promotion rates in terms of who gets promoted and who doesn't, who stays in your organization, who doesn't, and why. And And I find that that can be quite revealing as to how things happen within a company. Because what I find is a lot of organizations will kind of look at recruitment and say, okay, we've got a pay gap of X, we need to recruit more women into these roles, and they're kind of looking at that as an avenue, forgetting that a really big piece is your ability to retain people. Yeah. And you know, people will stay where they feel valued, where they feel that there's potential for career progression, where they feel respected. So I always advise organizations to look at their retention data. And if you were to cut and splice it, gender, ethnicity, age, disability, you know, regions, people, you know, going off on sick leave, paternity leave, whatever, what would that tell you? Because I think that's always quite interesting. And the same with promotions as well. And that can always be quite revealing. So if an organization didn't want to, you know, jump straight into their pay gap data, maybe because they were a smaller organization, if you look at your promotion and retention data, I think that would give you some insight into how the organization is functioning. And then it kind of hinges on, well, what does that say about our workplace culture if this cohort of people are never able to progress beyond these two grades?
Yeah, that's really interesting because it just reminded me of this research I saw last year by the Josh Bersin company, which they found that well communicated pay equity was 13 times more important in retaining your employees than higher levels of pay. So as organizations, you know, we spend so much time thinking about, oh, should we have a 3% budget? Can we afford to have a 4% budget? But that has such a small impact on our retention rates, that extra 1%, which is, it, you know, could be an extra million that they're spending. But it's that well communicated pay equity, because people are less bothered with the extra 1%, but they're more concerned with, am I being treated fairly? And I would really recommend anyone listening to check out that research, because it talks about better financial outcomes, customer satisfaction, retention, engagement. It even talked about employees having a sense of belonging in the workplace because of that message around fairness and equity. And it was also around better ability to innovate as an organization. So yeah, that retention piece is really interesting. But I guess what you were saying is also then break it down by looking at retention within different groups of employees as well.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, I did some work with the Fawcett Society and Runnymede Trust, where we were looking at the experiences of women of colour in the UK. So from like early entry into the workplace all the way to exiting into self-employment. And one of the key things that came up time and time again was the barriers for women trying to get into senior leadership roles and the bias and discrimination that they were facing. So, if those organizations were to look at their promotion rates and their retention rates just by ethnicity, they would probably see a stark contrast if they were to look at, you know, black women compared to white women, to look at Asian women compared to white women. And that gives you so much insight into what is genuinely happening within your organization, as opposed to obsessing over a figure that doesn't really reflect, you know, what is happening within your organization.
So if we get maybe a little bit more technical, not too much, but into the gender pay gap. And one of the things that we find, I guess we're used to it now, but we do find at times a little bit frustrating, is the calculations, which I think can do with a lot of improvements and changes. It's things like, simple things like the numbers look at your salary after salary sacrifice, which to me sounds very strange. But when you are working on pay gaps, are there changes or legislative or regulatory changes that you would recommend that should be made to help us get a better understanding of pay gaps, because just publishing the 6 numbers isn't necessarily a great, doesn't really tell us much about pay. So what else would you recommend could be added or changed to the gender pay gap legislation, which would then obviously apply to ethnicity pay gap as well?
Yeah. So I'm not a stats person. I know a lot of stats people, and they all say the same thing, that they really loathe pay gap reporting and the things that organisations have to report on. So I'm not in the best place to say what I think what else should be in the regulations. But there are two things that I think would be helpful. The first one is to allow people the space to cut and splice the data in a way that makes sense for their organization. So, like I said before, looking at kind of promotion data, retention data, I think would be super, super powerful to help organizations and, people who read in the reports really get a sense of what's happening within the organization. And the second thing would be to make it compulsory to have some kind of narrative or action plan, because currently for us in the UK, that isn't the case. That's not in the regulations. I know that in Ireland they have to produce something. I would like to see more organisations produce narratives to show that they have delved into the data and they are, gathering insights from it, and to have that plan around what they're going to do next with the information that they have. So for me, they are the two biggest things in terms of, you know, what's calculated and how it's calculated. I'm not best placed to to answer
Okay.
that.
Okay, so you're saying more of an action plan, so not just a list of numbers, but what are the next steps, or what are they doing with this? And it's not just an exercise that's completed, and now it's going to be another 12 months before we look at anything around this.
Yes, totally.
Okay, so that's all really interesting. I guess there might be a lot of organizations and HR people listening to this, and to close off, what would be the one tip that you would give them to say, if you are looking at your gender or ethnicity pay gap reporting, this is the thing to look out for, or this is the thing to focus on, or anything at all? What is the one tip that you would give them?
Yes. So I was recently reading an article, and there was a survey done called What Women Want, and they were talking about the things that women want within the workplace. And there was a stat that really stood out to me, and it said that 55% of women would still give an organization a chance if they had a high gender pay gap figure, provided they could explain what they were going to do, showcase their action plans. And if I was to give one tip, I would quote that and tell organizations to hold on to that, because what that is saying is that people are ready to be more forgiving and understand that your pay gap is high, providing that you can communicate what you're going to do about it, providing you can communicate that you understand why you have it, and here are the things that you're going to focus on. And so for me, that sounds like people are crying out for that education and much more communication around their pay gap data. And that will be, I mean, the figure might not be the same for ethnicity pay gap reporting, but the desire to know what you're genuinely doing about it, I think, would be a real bonus for your existing employees and future employees. And alongside that, I would also really advise organisations that when they are putting their reports together, is to not feel constrained by the data that you have to share, and to really bring your business persona and characteristic to the reports. I mean, I was reading. I'm working with a client that's in the creative sector, and they showed me their draft gender pay gap report. And I read it and I was like, I just felt a bit meh reading it. I was like, yeah, here's the data. There's a few lines. I was just like, meh. And then I looked at their EDI strategy and I was blown away by the difference. Like the EDI strategy was full of life and full of character and talked about the journey, what had worked, what hadn't, what they're going to do differently, what was happening within the sector, what their aspirations were. So much so that when I was reading it, I was thinking, if I was looking for a job, I would want to work there because it was so compelling. But then I was like, I've just read the gender pay gap report, which was really dry and really bland and told me nothing about the organization. So one of the recommendations I'll be making to them is to bring that energy and that personality to your pay gap reports as well, because that is the document that's going to be out in the public eye. You know, if they don't publish their EDI strategy, no one's going to know about it except for the people that work there. And so, I would really encourage organizations to really own their data and to bring their true business personality to their pay gap reports as well, and to not be afraid to talk about what the data says about them, not be afraid to talk about the things that have and haven't worked, not be afraid to talk about their own learning journey, because that is what people ultimately want to see. It's the same with what you were saying about, people they're not striving to earn the most money that they can, but they want to know that they're paid fairly. They want to know that the decision around their pay has been made in an equitable manner. So it's about, understanding what people genuinely value when it comes to pay gap reporting. It's not necessarily the number, but it's how you communicate what you're doing about that. If you think you'll be able to get it down, and if you don't, explaining it's because of the sector, it's because of our business model, but here's what we can focus on to make our workplace much more inclusive. So they would be the two pieces of advice that I would give organizations.
Thanks. That's great advice because I don't know if it's because it's just considered to be a legal requirement that there's a lot less effort that goes into this than something like you mentioned, the EDI policies. Just from a pay perspective, I have a tip as well for people because, and I think this was research, well, it was the Institute for Women's Policy Research in the US, and they found that the biggest impact was to stop asking the question about salary history in the interview process. And I think, when we talk about pay transparency, for example, it's making sure that we have a very clear process in how we pay people and not leave it to their ability to negotiate a good salary. And I think if there's one thing that is very easy, because we can have all of our fancy EDI policies, but often I think we want to do all of that without making any real change. But if we're serious about making a change, I think this is such a simple change to make, is just to ask recruitment teams and line managers to stop asking the question of what is your salary? Or even I think the question of what are your expectations, because our expectations are built around our experiences. And so you might have a much lower expectation if you haven't been paid fairly in the past. So that would be my one pay tip, is stop asking about current salary.
Yes, I concur, because it places the onus on that person to set a benchmark, and then organizations get into this whole, oh, well, they've not asked very much, so I can offer very little. I mean, I've even had managers admitting that to me, that if a female candidate, and it's often a female candidate, will give a low number, if they offer them the job, they're like, oh, well, I've saved the organization X amount of money.
Yeah.
And like, we're all just like putting our head in our hands,
Yeah.
like, but no, that's not right.
Yeah. How would you feel if that happened to you? Ask that manager that question. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks a lot, Michelle, for all of your insights, expertise. And if anyone wants to connect with Michelle, we will share this with the podcast. But what would be the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, so there's two ways. So the first is that I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Michelle Gyimah. So if you want to connect, then please do send me a connection invitation and I will accept. And the second way is to listen to my podcast. It's called Beyond the Pay Gap Figure, where I talk about all things pay gaps, and I try to kind of lift the lid on what organizations are really thinking and struggling with, and to provide some help in kind of moving forward with addressing pay gap problems.
Great. Thanks. And if anyone has any questions for Michelle, please do send it over to us. It's podcast@3rstrategy.com. And we will speak to you next month on another episode of A Case of the Mondays.